Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event sponsored by the University of Minnesota's Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute. I'm John Coleman. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota, and we are absolutely delighted to have you all here. This is Heller-Hurwicz's third time in New York. Each of these events has been, I think, really intellectually exciting and quite compelling. Last year at this time, we had a panel on financial regulation. All of these panels really are hitting key issues at key points in time, and I think bring together some of the best of academia and those in the real world, as we might say. The Institute is housed in the College of Liberal Arts, and it is a part of the tradition of excellence of our economics department. I arrived at the university just last year, and I will say the reputation of the Department of Economics at the University of Minnesota preceded my arrival, which is to say I was well aware of how strong a department this was, routinely considered one of the top 10 departments in the country, a real leader in intellectual and methodological rigor, leader in theory and both the theory and the tools to study that theory. So I was quite excited to arrive at the college and become part of the community in the College of Liberal Arts. I'm in the political science department, where we freely steal ideas, tools, methodologies, and other good things from economics quite routinely. So it was a pleasure to come to the university. And Heller-Hurwicz, I think, plays a really important role in this research excellence. As I mentioned before, it brings together policymakers, scholars, industry leaders to bring together insights and approaches and analyses from their particular perspectives. And what the Institute hopes to do is to create some fruitful discussion about public policy and potential change in policy where that may be appropriate. As I mentioned, we've had 3 of these. This will be the 3rd of these in New York now, and I think each has been really quite exciting in the range of ideas that were expressed and the implications that these ideas had for potential either public policy or changes in private market behavior. Tonight's topic, New Trends in Income Inequality, reflects that focus and that timeliness quite directly. I'm really looking forward to hearing our panelists discuss this topic. As somebody who studies elections and voting and campaign finance and the intersection of politics and economics, the issue of income inequality is not surprisingly one that I find particularly important and particularly interesting. I focus heavily on the way that it plays out in the political world and how it either resonates or doesn't resonate with voters and with other segments of the public. So I'm particularly interested to hear this tackled from the perspective of economics tonight. I am pleased to introduce one of tonight's co-hosts, Gary Stern. Dr. Stern is a Heller-Hurwicz Advisory Board member and the former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He is also the author of the 2004 book, Too Big to Fail: The Hazards of Bank Bailouts, which, you can tell by the timing, highlighted that issue well before it became a very prominent public issue in 2008. Thank you all again for being here and joining us tonight, and I invite Dr. Stern up to the podium.
Thank you, Dean Coleman, and thank you all for joining us this evening. As noted, I'm Gary Stern. Let me say a word or two about the Institute and my association with it, and we'll get into the panel discussion. The Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute was founded in 2010 with the mission of informing public policy and supporting frontier economic research. I'm proud to say that my association with economics at the University of Minnesota goes back more than 30 years now, due to the close collaboration between the economics faculty at the university and the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, where I spent the bulk of my career. It is only natural, it seems to me, that this institute would be housed in the University of Minnesota's economics department, as it is born from the legacies of two outstanding economists, the influential policymaker Walter Heller, who was responsible for major policy initiatives as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, and the economic giant Leo Hurwicz, recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2007, who developed the theory of mechanism design, which lies at the heart of solving many of today's economic dilemmas. Through events such as this panel, we hope to communicate findings, spark dialogue and debate, and inform and influence public policy and practice. I'm looking forward to learning about income inequality this evening, an issue that I find vexing from a number of perspectives. It is now my genuine pleasure to introduce Kevin Warsh, who will be moderating our panel this evening. Kevin has degrees from both Stanford and Harvard. He is currently a visiting fellow in economics at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and lecturer at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. He advises several private and public companies and is a member of the Group of 30. Equally importantly, Kevin served as a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve from 2006 to 2011. And if you want to get a nice handle on Kevin's career in public service, you might try reading David Wessel's book on the financial crisis, In Fed We Trust, and you'll get an understanding of Kevin's absolutely critical role in helping to manage the crisis and limit the damage. Kevin.
Gary, thank you very much for hosting me. Thanks to the Institute. It's great to be here. What I'm going to do over the course of the next 4 minutes is briefly introduce the panelists, see if I can't frame this discussion a little bit to make it relevant, not just to the political season, but to the task we have in economics. Give you a couple of facts just to try to baseline the discussion, and then let the two scholars take us in a couple of directions. First, let me thank Gary. It's been now 5 years since I've been at the Fed. Gary and I got a chance to work together, and Gary was remarkable around the FOMC in several respects. One is, when we were having a debate about what to do in the darkest days of the crisis, we were having a debate about interest rate policy, he did this thing which was quite uncommon. He would listen to what his colleagues had to say, and then he'd think about it, and then he'd offer his own judgments. It is perhaps more common at these sorts of meetings to show up with beautifully prepared prose by the brilliant staffs and economists from the reserve banks and the board staff and read them just as a two-handed economist is. At the end of some of my first early meetings, certain colleagues, distinguished academics, would give their views on the economy, and Don Cohn would sit next to me, and I'd pull him aside and I said, "So what's he for? Is he for raising rates or cutting them?" And Don said to me, "That's the trick, we'll never know." Well, with Gary, you'd know. And Gary would also jump into the discussion, and he would say something which is also, I think, too uncommon. He would say, well, that question that's being raised about productivity, that question that's being raised about the effects even of income inequality, we're not that good. We don't understand that question, so let's not presume that we do. And that sort of humility that Gary brought to the Fed and the FOMC was incredibly important at that moment, and I would suggest that that kind of humility would be useful to bring to the institution now and in the future. Let me then just briefly introduce the two panelists who are going to drive this discussion. Fatih is a distinguished scholar at the University of Minnesota, as you all know, And he does something which I'd say is somewhat unique to the Minneapolis Fed. But the Minneapolis Fed has this really strong tradition of building on the staff work of the Reserve Bank and bringing a range of views from academia to bear on big policy questions. I think it's been done better at the Minneapolis Fed than anywhere, and Fatih has been a big contributor to that effort in recent years. Second, let me introduce Peter Orszag. Peter and I have overlapped in government in different institutions, and he's a very thoughtful, serious scholar. And I would say he's able to do two things, which I'm afraid is rare also. When he has a boss in the political season, he's able to be a very persuasive proponent for the views that are on offer. But when he's not in those positions, when he's back here in the private sector as he is now, he's going to be joining Lazard as a vice chairman in this upcoming May. He's able to really be an independent thinker, unafraid to break away from the guild, do his own data analysis, his own empirical work, and share findings wherever they would rest. And I would say this again is another quality which isn't as common as we might hope. So Fatih and Peter are going to really be able to join this discussion and have a pretty robust debate. Now, I'm supposed to be their moderator, but as I learned at the Fed, moderator doesn't mean mediator, so I'm allowed to weigh into this discussion. So let me weigh in with some framing questions, which you might consider not to be exactly neutral in their presentation, but Peter and Fatih can take them in any direction they want. So we find ourselves in the political season here in 2016. It is no surprise then that income inequality is on the front pages of the newspapers. It's in politicians' speeches in both parties. I think our purpose tonight, though, is to do something also a little uncommon, which is try to bring some light to this, not just heat. Try to bring some data and analysis to these vexing questions. This is the tradition of what central bankers should be doing. It's the tradition of what great universities like the University of Minnesota is intended to do. So let's try that. I'll ask some framing questions, and Peter and Fatih and the audience can engage along this if they wish. So the Fed seems to believe that the economy is near full employment. Yet more than 2/3 of the American people, by some polls 78% of the American people, think the economy is on the wrong track. Which of them are right? Could they both be right? The Fed seems to think that the economy is really growing at perhaps as strong a level as potential would allow it to grow. Yet Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders represent about 65% of the American electorate. Are these facts consistent or inconsistent? Does income inequality, the subject of tonight's discussion, does that explain maybe the remarkable narrative of our politics? Does that explain Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders? Or is income inequality, at least as we enter the election season, is it a convenient distraction from an economy that has been growing considerably below our U.S. historical performance over the course not just of the 6 or 7 years since the financial crisis, but really over the course of the last couple of administrations, Republican and Democrat? So is income inequality in some sense the defining issue of our time, as it's said, because economic growth has been so poor? Or is income inequality and economic growth things that we have to wrestle with at the same time? I do hear continued discussions about income inequality, and our panelists here will join that discussion, but I'll ask one final question as a central banker. We talk about income inequality, but what about balance sheet inequality? I ask that, and here I'll offer my own views. The Federal Reserve, in the post-crisis period, has engaged in aggressive quantitative easing, buying long-term treasury assets, making their yields go down, with a design principle, meaning risk assets, stocks, houses, leveraged loans, high-yield bonds would move up in price. Well, who have been the beneficiaries of this kind of policy? It is certainly not my intention to suggest the Fed intended for the well-to-do to have assets that are worth more, but is that an ultimate effect of this kind of aggressive monetary policy here in the U.S. and abroad? In central bank speak, we talk about the distributional consequences of the policies we undertake. I view that as, in some sense, a euphemism, because the underlying facts are these. There is about $80 to $85 trillion of economic wealth in the United States. About 24 trillion of that is represented in risk assets, like stocks, another 24 trillion or so represented in housing. So I asked myself, I wonder who owns all this? Well, the top 10% of the US population, as measured by household, owns 75% of that 84 trillion. Only about half of US households own any stocks, have any balance sheet wealth to speak of at all. And in fact, 96% of the income for folks that are in the bottom 75% of the income distribution is all W-2 income. There's no balance sheet wealth to speak of. So this income inequality debate is interesting, but I suspect most of you reflect not just on your income in a year, but what's the wealth that's been created. So the central bank, I don't believe, is in the business of redistribution, but this kind of aggressive monetary policy certainly has distributional consequences. And after the presentations, I might poke each of our presenters to give a bit of response to that. With that, let me introduce Peter and Fatih to the stage. I'm going to sit conveniently in the corner. They're each going to take you through a presentation for about 15 minutes. Then I'll engage with them in some questions, then we'll turn it to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be speaking about income inequality. I guess it won't surprise any one of you when I say that income inequality has increased substantially, and we have seen tremendous changes in the income distribution. But I think it's like less well known or emphasized that these are not new trends. Economists have known that inequality in the United States has been increasing for 4 decades, since the 1970s. And not surprisingly, there is a lot of debate, right, today about what's the appropriate policy response. And economists have been trying to understand the causes of these trends, really going back to the 1990s. So there is, at this point, 25 years of research on the causes and consequences of inequality. So you might guess, by this point, we probably know the answer. And you would be wrong, because progress in this area has been severely hampered by the lack of good data. And sometimes I joke that, if the public really knew how poor the data that economists have access to in studying inequality, you will freak out. Okay, good thing they don't know. And I'm very happy to expand on this during the panel discussion. I think this is a very serious problem in conducting research on inequality. Now, due to a confluence of factors and maybe some lucky coincidences, in the last several years, I would say maybe 5 years or so, there has been an explosion of amazingly good quality data that we were not able to access before, and that has changed our views and introduced some new facts that really we didn't know even 5 years ago. So today I would like to share 3 main topics, facts on 3 main topics in inequality. The first one is, what is the role of employers? These are well-defined objects, right? We all have jobs and they are linked to some firm or an employer. What's the role of your employer in inequality? And for reasons that will become clear, I hope, in a few moments, I will separately look at the bottom 99% of the economy and the top 1%. Then I will turn to something that I believe is very much underemphasized in public discussion. What is the distribution of lifetime incomes? For many questions, that is actually what we should be caring about. And then I will turn to a third angle, which is what is happening to lifetime incomes in the United States. How do you compare a typical, say, daughter or son to the father and mother a generation ago? And I will elaborate on these 3 points. So turning to the first question, what is the role of employers? I will first start with a question that it may take a little bit to actually appreciate why this is an important question. I will ask, what part of the distribution in the United States is inequality going up? And the reason I raise this question is, if you turn the pages of New York Times, Wall Street Journal, any media account, you would be led to believe that everything is happening with the top 1%, right? Top 1% is separating from the rest, but really, how about the bottom 99? I will talk about that today, okay? So let me introduce a graphical framework, and bear with me for just a minute, it will pay off. I will try to show you how we measure the rise in inequality. So imagine that this is, you have seen graphs like this before, a nice bell-shaped curve, which represents the US income distribution. And economists, we like to talk about not the dollar values per se, but it's easier to talk about what you see here. Is this thing working? It doesn't. The percentiles that you see on the x-axis there, so P10, what it means is it's the income level below which about 10% of the US population earns. And P90 is the income level above which 10% of the income distribution lies. So now imagine that this is the income distribution in 1980s. And suppose that we come to 2013 and the income distribution is like the light blue graph. How did the distribution change? Well, you can visually see some changes. The average income has gone up, but if you look carefully, the dispersion has also gone up. One way we are going to measure that is by comparing each percentile. So what happened to the median? P50 is the median, meaning the dead center of the US economy. Now, we can, for example, measure each percentile. The 90th percentile, delta Y, is the change in the 90th percentile from 1981 to 2013. Now, with that said, let's turn to the data. What really happened when I dropped the top 1%? Let's not talk about them for a moment. What happened to the rest of the economy? And this is the graph. And I will try to explain what this graph measures. If you look at the right, I marked P90. Remember, that's the high income, the high end of the income distribution. It increased roughly by about 40% from 1981 to 2013. Now look at the left, the 20th percentile, that's the low end of the income distribution. What happened to that part? The growth has been zero. So what happens if you increase the top and keep the bottom the same? It's as if somebody took the entire income distribution and stretched it. The fact that this graph, in economics, if you have seen enough statistics, does this thing work? We rarely ever see something as smooth as this. There is no smoothing. This is the true data. There is no regression or anything. This is actually how the data looks like, and it's like a straight line. Why does that matter? Well, let's look at, for example, how much has the gap between high income and the median increased? It's given by the red line over there, the arrow. And it's like a straight line, meaning that between every percentile, it's as if somebody completely stretched the distribution. And it's true for the entire part. So I will pose my question again. Where did the inequality increase in the distribution? The answer is everywhere. So I would like you, when you read an article about the top 1% pulling off, no, it's everywhere, okay? So I will get to top 1% in just a moment. I haven't forgotten. The second question I will turn to now, what role did firms play in this? Meaning that how much of the rise in inequality happened as rising pay gap between employers, and how much of it has happened? We have spent quite a bit of time understanding that, and we came to the following conclusion. There are two things going on. First, it seems that the average worker quality across firms has been stretched out. Some firms are increasingly employed high-quality workers, and some works are increasingly specializing in low-quality workers. Quality measured by skill. Second, this separation is not arbitrary. It's not random. As it turns out, highly skilled workers are sorting into high-quality firms. So there's an increasing reshuffling of the US labor and business market, whereby now a smaller number of firms are employing an increasing number of high-skilled workers. Now let's turn to top 1%. I showed you, but I didn't show you. So when I showed you this graph, I marked 99 groups, and I left out intentionally the top 1%. Let me put it there. Oh, there's something interesting going on there. right? There's some nonlinearity there. I'm going to expand on that. I'm going to take the top 1% and subdivide it into 100 groups now. And this is the same graph. Now, look at the low end. The left side is 99. That is the poorest top 1%. And these people are making $350,000 a year. And the right end is the richest, in a way, of these 100 groups, the top 0.01%. They make about $4 million. But what I really would like you to notice here is, look at the red line. That's the average pay at the firms that these top 1%ers are working. Do you notice something? It's just like the wage data. So even within the top 1%, some people are making a lot more because the firms that they are working at is paying a lot more than before. But again, the same caveat. Look at the top. These are firms with less than 10,000 employees. What if I look at mega firms? By the way, there are only 950 of these mega firms in the US, the Walmarts and all the big companies. Now the picture changes in the sense that the very rich in the very large firms, they do actually deviate from the firm average pay. So for example, the very rich in very big firms, their incomes relative to their coworkers more than doubled during this time. So there is some truth that the CEO pay has increased, but what I would like to emphasize, this is very limited to a small number of very large firms. Why do they get all the media attention? Because that's the only data we used to have. It's not I don't think anybody has bad intentions. The data that we had until recently was called the ExecuComp data that tracks the CEOs and executives of the top 500 firms in the US. But as you can see here, they are the exception to the rule. But that led a lot of people to conclude the following. So Paul Krugman says, he writes this every week, so this is one example. He says, as for wages and salaries, all the big gains are going to a tiny group of individuals holding strategic positions in corporate suites. The Bible of Piketty says, the primary reason for increased income inequality in recent decades is the rise of the supermanager. This is not idle talk. As you know, the Dodd-Frank Act, which has recently been implemented by the SEC, requires now every large corporation to report the CEO to median worker pay. Now, I will ask the following question. What if, are they right? Are the CEOs and executives an important driver of inequality? How can we answer? I will remove every single CEO from my data because I have them. Now, how much would the top 1% inequality go up if we had no CEOs? Don't blink. If you have sharp eyes, you can see 3 lines there. I can barely see from here. They are all the same. What are these lines? The blue line is when I drop all the CEOs, and the green line is when I drop all the top 5 employees. How do they look? They look identical. So dropping the CEOs has no effect on the rise in inequality. Why? I'm happy to share later. There's a very simple math behind them. There are not that many CEOs in the US to account for inequality. Now, having said that, I want to now, in the limited time I have, I will turn to the second question, which is very dear to my heart. And one conclusion that I take from my work on inequality is that the top 1% discussion is way overblown. We are devoting too much attention to it. Why? Let's look at this question. Let's ask the following question. Suppose we walk out into Main Street, United States, and we pick 100 random individuals who are 55 years old. For each individual, we compute the lifetime income from age 25 to 55. And then we rank them from number 1, the lowest income person, to 100, the highest income person. Again, this is not point in time. And again, we couldn't compute this a few years ago. We just didn't have the data. The question is, if you take the 90th person, okay, at the very top, and the 10th person at the bottom, what is the ratio of their income? Having spent many years on this, if you had asked me, I was led by the literature, I would say 4, a ratio of 4, or 5, or 6. Those are the indirect estimates that you see. We have now the data to calculate directly without any assumptions, and the answer turns out to be 40. Okay? To me, this is pretty terrifying, in the sense that if you take the 10 richest countries in the world and the 10 poorest countries in the world, Take the ratio of the GDP per capita of these two groups, you get a number like 40. So we are replicating the entire world income distribution within the United States, even though this is one of the richest countries on earth. And you cannot explain this. We have done work with disability rate, by incarceration, by informal sector, and so on. It seems to be very robust. It's not men versus women. The ratio, if you just take men, is 38. If you just take women, is 37. Okay? One last question, which I think, Kevin gave us the task of linking this to some of the current debates. I will just state the facts, but then you can make up your conclusions. How does the current generation of 55-year-olds compare to their father's generation? And this is the key graph. Let me tell you what the blue line is. It's not very well drawn, I apologize. Each year, there is a data point there. And the first data point, which is at 1993, is the lifetime income, median lifetime income of the father cohort, which is the average income for a person between 1963 to 1993. And I computed every single year, and I normalized the son's cohort to 1. Now you can see here that the fathers, this is I think pretty dramatic. The cohort that entered the US labor market in the 1960s, over their lifetime, they earned about 20% more than the income of their children. And if you look at women, you don't see that, okay? The mother's cohort, by the way, this is not because women are working now more than before. I forgot to say that. This is conditional. This is only looking at working men and working women, okay? Now, just to summarize, I'm out of time. Just to summarize, over one generation, the median lifetime income for men declined by 10 to 20%, depending on the precise definition that you use. For women, it increased by 20 to 30%. For the whole population, the best case scenario is that there has been no growth in lifetime incomes. And if you take some other definitions, there has been a decline of 10%. Now you might think, well, there's some changes like increased retirement benefits and healthcare benefits that only explains about 5%, okay? Now, just to give you a comparison, if the share of the pie that the median worker got hadn't changed over this period, the median worker's income would have gone up by 36%. So you have an economy that grows, the pie is growing by 36%, but the average American male is 20% poorer than his father's generation. Just to conclude, 5 key conclusions. Hopefully we can discuss some of these more. Income inequality rose across the entire distribution. And I think we are not doing a service to anyone when we just bring every discussion to the top 1%. There's a lot more going on. And the pay inequality rose across employers. We have some thoughts about why this might be happening. CEO and executives, the gap between the CEO and executives and the median worker in that firm has only increased in 1,000 firms. We have very clear results on this. Look at firms with 1,000 employees. The gap has been completely constant over 30 years. My view is that we should talk the real problems that Americans, we should be focusing on, the enormous inequality in lifetime incomes. As we know, inequality in the long run always creates some big problems, and we are facing some of this today. And second, the median male worker today is poorer than the father's generation. Not why, but what are the consequences of that? Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I'm glad to be with all of you. I'm going to talk about some things that are very complementary to what we just heard, and that also raise some questions about the conventional wisdom on this topic, which is what I think a lot of this research is suggesting, that the popular narrative is off base, if you will. So to just get us started, here are 3 things that I think if you read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal every day, you would, quote, know, end quote. The first is that national income has shifted away from labor compensation and towards productive capital. That's, in a sense, the Piketty thesis. The second is that a substantial share of the rise in inequality is occurring within each firm. The CEO is diverging from the typical worker, and we just heard a bit about that. And the third is that workers are increasingly mobile, shifting from one tenuous job to another. And what's interesting about this conventional wisdom is that each of these three is more false than true. So let's try to walk through this. And I note that a lot of this is based on some joint work with Jason Furman, who is the chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors and is actually contained in a paper that's posted on the White House website if anyone's interested. And at the very end, I want to turn to a different dimension of inequality that is starting to get more attention, but that I think deserves much more than it is receiving. So let's first go through these myths. First, it is true that labor's share of national income has declined. You can see that there. But the reason that it has declined, or the sort of mirror image of that, since the shares have to sum to 100, is not productive capital, but it's instead land and housing. So if you break down the shares of national income into different forms of capital, the decline in labor income is mirrored basically by a dramatic rise in returns to land and housing, which is a much different thing than returns to productive capital. And you can see that returns to capital excluding housing are basically in aggregate effectively flat. That is not what one would expect from the popular discussion. And what's interesting about the big return to land and housing is it is very likely tied up with the topic of tonight's discussion, the rise in inequality, because that then drives pricing of housing in particular in areas that have scarce housing. We can come back to why that is occurring. Now, I'm not going to belabor the second point because you just heard a lot about it. I would just note there is at least one other study suggesting basically the same thing, that this is from Richard Freeman and others. They look at establishments instead of firms, so there's one difference there. A firm can have multiple establishments, and they also exclude the top 1% because their data are based on a survey, and it's top-coded, so you don't really get much information about the top 1%. But the same basic conclusion holds here, which is that out of the 8.3 percentage point increase in the variance of wage inequality, 5.6 percentage points, or roughly 2/3, is between establishments, not within them. And that strikes me as being entirely consistent with the research you just heard that's based on firms, and I won't repeat that other than to say there has been some back and forth about methodologies and carping about whether the conclusion that all of the rise in wage inequality is between firm. I think that misses the point. Whether it's 60% or 80% or 90% doesn't matter. It's not zero. And the way that the popular discussion has gone, it suggests that the reason that wage inequality has been going up is that within each firm, there's been a dramatic increase in the spread. And instead, what's been happening is there may or may not be a little bit of an increase in the spread within each firm, but the firms are just growing apart from one another. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. I will skip the slide that you just saw a lot about. Third myth, if you will, is that we are increasingly mobile and we're moving again from job to job in a rapid fashion. The data, if anything, suggests exactly the opposite, that over time there has been a decline in both the underlying churn in the labor market and also a dramatic decline in geographic mobility. And I highlight that only because typically people move for a job, especially working age families. So on the left you see, we typically focus each month on the net jobs created, so 200,000. That's the difference between two much larger numbers, the number of jobs created and the number of jobs destroyed. If you looked at those gross numbers, that is giving you a better indication of underlying fluidity or churn in the labor market, and those have been trending down significantly over time. At the same time, the share of Americans who move across state boundaries is roughly half of what it was 25 or 30 years ago. There are lots of explanations for this. I'm going to come to one in a moment. But one thing just to note is occupational licensing is much more prominent today than it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, something like 5% of the US workforce required a license in order to perform the tasks of the job. Today, it's above 25%. And one would expect that to occur as employment shifts towards education and healthcare where licensing is more prevalent, but that explains only a small share of the overall rise. And we are seeing licensing prevalent not just in, for ambulance drivers where you might think, of course that makes sense, but in jobs like, and I'm not making this up, dog walkers, barbers. A lot of this is state and local driven, but that impedes mobility both across jobs and across regions, because just because you qualified for a job in region A doesn't mean that you can then move to region B and do the same job because you need to get relicensed. I'm going to skip this. Let me get to now. So far, everything I've said is fully consistent with what you heard before. Let me, though, suggest there may be, and I'm saying may here, as opposed to what I've already said, which I think is backed up by the data. What I'm going to put forward now is a hypothesis that's not yet proven, and I want to just be clear that I'm out over my ski tips. But let me suggest to you that an alternative perspective for all three of these facts is that we have heard a lot about superstar individuals over the past 20 years, that some people just perform extremely well on the world stage. It is entirely plausible to me that instead we have superstar firms, that as the world has globalized, there are some firms that are doing extremely well, they're at the frontier, if you will, and there are other firms that are laggards. That is consistent with a whole variety of evidence, for example, from the OECD, highlighting very big differences in productivity across firms within a particular sector within a country. There are some firms that have very high labor productivity and other firms that have much lower labor productivity, basically doing the same thing. And what's interesting to me is this chart in and of itself, I think, would warrant attention, but it may well reflect the same phenomenon, which is that we have seen a dramatic rise in the variance of capital returns at the firm level. So this is publicly traded US firms, but for their global income. I would note that the number of publicly traded firms is about half of what it was 25 years ago, so that's one thing one should worry about in terms of data limitations. The available evidence on this question does not suggest that that's a big deal, but we don't know for sure. And this is the return on invested capital as opposed to the return on equity, although the return on equity also shows a similar increase in spread. The reason is the return on invested capital shows the return to both debt and equity, and is, I think, therefore a better measure of operating performance because it is not messed up as debt-equity ratios change. So now what this is all publicly traded firms, return on invested capital, excluding goodwill, because again, I think that if you're looking at operating performance, that's a better way of looking at it. The data, including goodwill, show a similar pattern, although less dramatic, just to immediately answer that question. Take every company that's publicly traded and look at their return on invested capital, and then do the same thing that you saw for individuals, which is rank them, and then take the 90th percentile, the 75th median, 25th percentile, I guess we didn't put the 10th on here, and then just show that over time. And what you see, just to be clear, is 10% of US firms, that is at the 90th percentile, 10% of US firms in the 1970s were earning a return on invested capital of 20% or more. Today, that's almost 100%. A very dramatic increase. Now, you might think this isn't a big deal if firms are moving in and out of the high ROIC or high return on invested capital category. It's just they're going in and out, in and out, in and out. Instead, that's not the case. If you look at the firms that were above 25% ROICs in 2003, 85% were still in that high return category in 2013. So how does this tie together all the different facts? And again, I'm speculating here, but just to put it forward, we have seen this. First of all, before I get to the speculation, in and of itself, this is interesting because it suggests that there's something going on that is preventing other firms from entering these sectors. So it's either a barrier to entry in the form of intellectual property protection, or a big network effect, or something else, because one would normally think that competition would not allow these kinds of very high capital returns to persist among a notable subsegment of US firms. Second point, which I'm not out over my ski tips on, is this also highlights, and it's in a sense the perspective that you heard with regard to inequality, the importance of firms. Too much of modern economics ignores firms. It's as if they don't really matter. And why some firms do better and why other firms don't isn't really of interest to much of academic economics, and yet it seems to be driving a lot of inequality, and it also is manifesting itself in terms of a dramatic increase in capital returns. Now, how does this tie together the three facts? First, notice that the median here hasn't really moved. The mean's moved a little bit, but that's entirely consistent with there being no big change in the overall return to productive capital. It's just an increased spread of those returns, fact one. Fact two is, if these firms are enjoying very high capital returns, which all the evidence suggests then gets shared partially with workers, that could help to explain why the between-firm inequality it explains such a large share of the overall rise in inequality. As an example, the 5% wage increase. I can virtually guarantee you that if there are bus drivers who work for Applebee's, they did not enjoy a 25% wage increase last year. And the reason, again, is that Apple is generating a sufficient surplus to share it partially with workers. And then the third fact is reduction in mobility. Well, if you're on one of these rocket ship firms, you're not leaving. It may also be very hard to jump onto them because the workers at those firms aren't necessarily particularly inclined to let other people onto the rocket ship. So again, tentatively, what we do know is the three myths are basically wrong. And we also know that the capital returns at the firm level have increased their variance, and those two things may well be related to one another. Let me then finally turn to one final topic which has received very little attention, but I think it is related to the trends in lifetime income that you heard about at the end of the previous presentation. We have been experiencing a very dramatic increase in the inequality of life expectancy. So the good news for higher income people is not only is your income going up, but your life expectancy is going up very rapidly. So this shows you if you've made it to age 50, how many additional years of life you can expect to have at different parts of, it's close to a lifetime earnings concept. It's earnings basically in your peak earnings years based on Social Security earnings records. And what you can see is at the bottom of the distribution, there's very little change between those born in the 1930 and those born in 1960. This is based, by the way, on work of a National Academy of Sciences panel that I co-chaired with Ron Lee from Berkeley. At the very top of the income distribution, earnings distribution, you see a very dramatic increase in life expectancy. One way of putting this that sometimes is a bit more salient to people is if you're a 50-year-old male and you made it to age 50 and you're a male, born in 1930, and you ask what is the probability that you're going to live to age 85, in the bottom 25% of the earnings distribution, the answer was about a quarter, both for those born in 1930 and those born in 1960. For the top 20% of earners, if you were born in 1930, probability was about 45%. For those born in 1960, the probability is over 2/3. Very dramatic increase. Now, what does that do to Social Security, Medicare, and other entitlement programs, which is what the focus of the National Academy of Sciences study was? And the answer is, not too surprisingly, if the probability that you make it to age 85 goes up disproportionately for those in the top 20% of the earnings distribution, lifetime benefits under Social Security will become less progressive because of this increasing gradient in mortality or life expectancy, which is exactly what's happening. And the effects are very large. The increase in life expectancy that's shown here for the top quintile is equivalent to giving them, because of the present value of benefits goes up, is equivalent to a gift equal to 7% of their net worth at age 50. It's a pretty big gift if you think about it that way. Now the question becomes, what's driving this? So everything that you can possibly explain, so for example, smoking collapsed among better educated, higher income people, and it's come down much less rapidly at the bottom. obesity trends, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, can explain at most a quarter to a third of this phenomenon. So there is a big missing piece. And again, I'm going to go out over my ski tips now. I will put forward to you that I think the big missing piece is prolonged exposure to stress. The people in the bottom half of the income distribution, arguably for those born in the 1960s, are experiencing a much more stressful environment, mostly because of what was just shown. The probability that they're going to do better than their parents, which is one norm that many people inculcate early in life, has dwindled dramatically for those in the bottom 50 to 60% of the income distribution. And this may also help to explain why we're seeing the effects that Angus Deaton and Ann Case highlighted disproportionately or actually exclusively among less educated white, and I emphasize white, males. It's also females, but it's the white part that's important, because it's there that their lifetime prospects relative to their parents probably have diminished the most. For Hispanic and African Americans, even in those income distributions, part of the income distribution, the diminution from the overall labor market trends is at least outweighed, or at least partially, if not entirely outweighed, by expanded opportunity in the form of efforts to be more inclusive. And in any case, their parents suffered even more so, and so by that metric, they experienced much less stress. That strikes me as being much more plausible than the channel that Deaton and Case themselves put forward, which was access to doctors and the ability to then obtain opiates and get hooked on drugs, which was their mechanism. I would note one problem with my hypothesis. There's a whole variety of evidence suggesting prolonged exposure to stress does raise bad cholesterol, add to blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of which you'd think is associated with mortality. Unfortunately for me, about 2 months ago, there was a clever study that came out in Lancet studying UK females, age 50 and above. For them, and the headline was, stress doesn't kill you, unhappiness doesn't kill you, control of your life doesn't matter for your mortality. Because what they did is they looked at females in the UK, and it didn't look like self-reported stress was correlated with mortality after age 50. There's a huge but there, though. They adjusted or controlled for health at age 50. So what they were really saying is ignoring all the ill effects of stress on your life up to age 50, beyond that point, it doesn't seem to matter that much. And so I think the media on that question also has been somewhat disappointing. I would just close with saying I think this is the next frontier of the inequality debate. Because the effects are very large and they are so differentiated by income. And the final thing I'd say is, in terms of entitlement reform, the statements that were common 10, 15, 20 years ago, life expectancy has gone up by X and therefore we should raise the retirement ages by Y, ignores the fact that life expectancy, the mean, is not very informative for different parts of the distribution here. And we basically, I think, need to be very careful about any policy change that's motivated by the change in average life expectancy when that average masks such big differences underneath it. Thank you very much.
Let's see if these microphones are working. Can you hear us okay? There we go. So I was impressed by both presentations in a couple respects. First, Fadi said at the outset something which Peter and I and many of our colleagues understand, which is our ability to compute data today is fundamentally different than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And so getting access to data sets and massive computational power suggests that what you just observed over the course of the last 35 minutes or so is more of what the economics profession should be capable of doing over the next 5 or 10 years. Now, Peter and I worked in different parts of government, but those parts of government are still stuck with old data sets and old regression models that haven't taken advantage of the new frontier. But hopefully one lesson from this discussion of inequality is the data is getting better and the policy judgments that we come to should improve. So I'm going to begin with a couple of factual empirical questions, and then because it's the political season, we're going to turn this into a little bit more filled with value judgments and policy prescriptions. 2 factual questions that you could both weigh in on your data sets. First is, what's income? So income comes from an employer, it comes in W-2 income, but income can also be unearned. It can be a transfer payment. In all the discussions by political figures, I've noticed that often transfer payments are excluded from the definitions of income. Either of you guys want to explore what your data suggests, and whether if we add in transfer payments facilitated by government, what are the consequences of income dispersion in that respect? Fadi, do you want to try that first?
Sure. Just to clarify first, in our analysis, we take wage and salary income. So even self-employment is not included, because our goal in this project is to link it to firms, right? So you need to have a firm. We have done in the Lifetime Inequality project, one important source of risk in life is disability, right? So the ratio of 40, you might wonder, at the bottom end, is it the case that we are mismeasuring incomes because these are disabled people, they have disability income, or these are people who are unemployed, they have some unemployment income. We have looked at that. I mean, it changes the numbers slightly, but none of the big picture actually. There's something related that actually I'm more worried about, but it goes in the wrong direction, and those are fringe benefits. So when you look at wages and salaries, we are of course excluding things like healthcare benefits and retirement benefits, as well as amenities at work. But as it turns out, those amenities are positively correlated with your income. So those at the top actually are getting more of those. So when you look at a more holistic measure of income that includes those, the numbers look worse than what you see here. So that's kind of my partial answer. I wish we had better data in our data set on transfers, but in our data period, like before age 55, that would mostly be welfare and unemployment insurance. And those are in the United States, this is not Europe, right? So the numbers are relatively small. Most of the transfers happen for retirement, and we exclude those workers.
So two comments. The first is, it is true that you can get a slightly different picture if you include transfers, but you should also take out taxes, because what matters for people is their after-tax net of transfer, actual disposable income, if you will, and that tends to offset some of the impact from including transfers. But ultimately, the easier way to kind of come at this question is to look at consumption, because that's what you really care about. And the evidence does suggest that the trend in consumption inequality has been basically mirrored the trend in income inequality. But that then brings us to the second question, which is, are we mismeasuring all this stuff? And the irony is, you noted we now have more data. In some sense, we have better data to answer some of these questions. But frankly, I would argue the quality of a lot of the official statistics, including numbers that you read about every day, has declined over the past 20 or 30 years, because anything that is based on a survey at this point has a massive problem. It's the same problem that's infecting political polling, but people don't realize that it infects government surveys too. So the Consumer Expenditure Survey, since we're talking about consumption, had a non-response rate, that is the share of people who just say, no, thank you, I'm not participating, of 15% in the 1980s. It's 33% today. The Consumer Expenditure Survey, by the way, is used in the weights for the price index too. So if you got those wrong, you're starting to kind of unravel. Even when people do participate, they often don't answer fully. So we are imputing a huge amount of data in the official income and poverty numbers because people don't really answer. So the imputations for Social Security, for things like supplemental security income, are sometimes a quarter, a half, and not only that, but by the combination of non-response, imputations, and then sometimes just misleading answers, the net result looks like it is increasingly biased. And so here's, for example, the total amount of income that's reported on the income survey that's used for the income and poverty numbers from things like supplemental security income or even from Social Security, we can compare to the administrative data where we know how much was actually spent. And you will get undercounting of, again, a quarter to a half on categories like that. So much so that if you use the administrative data instead of the survey data, the poverty rate for single females may be as much as 10 percentage points lower than what's officially reported, and the overall poverty rate would be 2 percentage points lower. Now, the irony is At the same time that the world's digitizing and we have so much, we're awash in data, we are still basing a lot of official statistics on a very problematic, if you will, collection methodology. And the question I have is whether we can better integrate the data that's out there, which may be biased also, into the official statistics.
Can I add to
Funny,
that?
please.
So at the beginning, I promised that I would elaborate on data, and especially when you study inequality, it's really impossible to get, to have any hope of measuring things if we don't have accurate data. So Peter actually highlighted consumption, that we can look at consumption, and that's an area that I have worked on too. If you want to track the consumption of the same individuals over time, in the United States, we have only one data set, and it's called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. And that's a survey, so it suffers from all the problems that Peter mentioned. But moreover, in 1993, because of budget cuts, that's the keyword I want to emphasize, because of budget cuts, they moved from face-to-face interviews to phone interviews. And again, from budget cuts, they moved from like a professional cleaning the data, because people give all sorts of answers, right? You have to sort it out. They moved to a computer program. Now, guess what happened? When you look at the PSID data, over time, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, after 90s, very strange things start to happen. Like, for example, we find inequality to go do very strange things. And for a long time, economists took this at face value. They didn't realize that some of these patterns were actually myths created by the low budget, research environment we are facing. And again, when we go to administrative data, we realize that some of those are actually just, statistical artifacts. So I find it actually important to inform the general public that, if we want to know about inequality, we need to have better data. Consumption is an area that we are still severely lacking. There is no administrative fix to this. And I actually kind of will, I have a slightly different view on this. I think despite the technology challenge, you can collect data very well with surveys if you devote resources.
You need follow-up.
It's a measure of, it's an issue about money. And I think that's an area where Europeans, especially for example, in Britain, it's much better done than in the US.
Great. So let me just use a little moderator's privilege and bring this together, and then I promise we're going to go from what we find fascinating, this boring question about data and the reliability of it, and then we're going to take this discussion in a much more jarring political direction where we make value judgments, where we're allowed to say things like, that was terrifying, what was just on the screen before. So let me make first two comments. First, there is a central irony to the discussion of inequality when the solution is redistribution of more income, and we refuse to include that which has already been distributed in our definitions of income. There's a central irony in the political debate left and right. If we're going to say this is outrageous and we need a more rigorous redistribution of wealth, then we should ask ourselves, well, what's been distributed already? We shouldn't look at the data before that. And I think what the three of us have been doing is quite transparent on that. What's happening both in certain corners of academia and many quarters of politics is to forget that. Second, I just want to follow up on a point that Peter made, which I think is very powerful. What our computational power and our understanding of economics shows now is how much error is involved in almost all of our assessments. We're sort of humbly showing that to you. Let me give you one example referencing the CPI, the measures of inflation that Peter referenced. When Gary and I were at the Fed, we had something called a comfort zone to measure price stability. We said that inflation, this was way back in 2006, inflation would be consistent with our mandate if it was running between 1% and 2%. Well, our friends at the Federal Reserve now are quite troubled because inflation is at 1.36% by their measure, and they want to get it to 2.00%. I would humbly suggest that inflation may or may not actually be at 1.36%. It might be at 2%. And we'd be the last to know the difference. So I think the powerful message broadly on income inequality and on other data is as our errors are getting more obvious, we shouldn't let the science of what we're doing get more precise. So we've just closed out the boring economics part of this discussion. Let me turn in the balance of our 23 minutes to sort of harder, more judgmental questions. Now we can take a little bit of our pocket calculators out and offer our own views. So Warren Buffett, Peter, in his letter to shareholders and his narrative to the broad population, when speaking about issues, he took seriously income inequality issues, but he said, let me be very clear, the children born today are better off. Perhaps he wasn't talking about relative differences between deciles, but they're better off. And I think what he meant was they have access to services, to a quality of life, to standards of living that are superior to their parents. And even the worst off among us wouldn't choose being born in a prior generation because of changes in healthcare and technology than those today. Do you agree or disagree with Buffett's calculation? And if you do agree with him, is it as terrifying as Fadi had us believe?
So there is, I think, unambiguously for someone born into a college-educated family in the United States today, the statement is absolutely true. So the opportunities that those children have and the health gains and what have you are phenomenal, and I think may well accelerate because we can see it is not impossible to imagine dramatic advances that we haven't yet really realized, for example, in healthcare, that don't spread all the way down the income distribution immediately. We could talk about some of those. Now, the harder question is for the bottom 25%, because you've seen real income down, not up, best flat. Life expectancy down to flat. Opportunity, perhaps, although if you look at it depends again on race, I think. If you look at the hard data on income mobility, while it hasn't declined, it hasn't gone up. And so I don't know that I would, if you're in the 10th percentile, that you can argue that it's better to be born today than it was 30 years ago. And then you get into larger questions about, for example, whether forces like climate change and others will cause, over the lifetimes of the children born today, damages that their predecessors 30 years ago did not face.
Fadi, do you want to weigh into that? So you don't know how you're going to be born and whether you're going to be in the bottom decile or in the top decile. You can roll the dice and be born in 2016, or you could be born in 1966. Which one do you want?
Well, I personally prefer 2016. But I think the general issue, we have been having lively discussions at Minneapolis at lunchtime with my colleagues on this. And this Warren Buffett's point, some other people have made it. I think that partly, I don't want to call Buffett's statement a fallacy, but the difficulty that the economists face is we are human beings and we are trying to study the society. And sometimes there is this, belief that we represent the average individual. The median male income today is about $40,000. So you should think from that perspective, I think. That do we know somebody who makes $40,000 today? And do we think that that person would not prefer to have born 30, 40 years ago? If you look at the median worker in 1960, that was a manufacturing worker. And that worker was working in a unionized, factory and had lots of benefits and a stable job. And today, the median workers, some of them are, manufacturing declined from 29% in 1980 to 11% today. Unionization, again, declined. I'm not actually particularly, in favor of the union argument. But just to give you an idea, the average worker had the protection coming from those jobs that today they don't have. So I think if you look at somebody who makes a lot of money, of course, it's very difficult for us to see from the eyes of the people who are the median workers. I think, Peter's evidence at the end was very eye-opening, that if you look at life expectancy, we all want to live, right? And if you're at the bottom 10%, 20, 30%, your life expectancy hasn't gone up. That's a very big, I would say, damning evidence. Now we're allowed to use those words, I guess.
One other thing that is worth noting, which is we like to study whether, if income went up, then the person should be better off. But the fact of the matter is, survey after survey and study after study shows what I think people intuitively know, which is we are relative human beings. We compare ourselves to others, not necessarily to some artificial construct of what we would have earned in some other world. And so for any given level of income at the 25th percentile, if income at the 99th percentile is up 300% and theirs is not, I'd argue the person doesn't feel as good about the situation. And similarly, for any given income at the 25th percentile, if it's finally dawned on you that you're actually not going to beat your parent, not beat your parent physically, but if you're not going to, if your income is not going to be higher than your parent, and it takes a while for that to sink in, that can affect people's perceptions. And I think this is a big part of, I mean, maybe the ultimate manifestation of this is the frustration with the establishment, which we are seeing in our political system, is much higher today than it was 30 years ago. And that reflects a frustration that a significant part of the population doesn't feel, objectively or not, but does not feel like the system is delivering what they want.
So let's follow up that theme and sort of bring it a little bit more into the headlines. So, Fadi, you described some of the statistics as terrifying. Let me ask it to you this way. If you believed that there was a perfect equality of opportunity, educational standards were strong everywhere, we were all getting very similar K through 12 educations, and you still had those results, would that be terrifying, or would that be a healthy society? So is the terrifying nature because of the equality of results, or is the terrifying nature because you think that in some sense that those statistics were pre-baked through no cause of the kid growing up?
I think that the one main reason I use the word terrifying is the fear of unknown, is that we actually don't fully understand it. And these are just a subset of what's going on. There are many other trends that are just as, let me give you an example. If you take not male or female, all workers working in large firms with more than 10,000 employees, the bottom end, the bottom 10% of these workers, their wages have declined by 40% from 1980 to 2000. So, we can be optimists and we can say, okay, everything will be fine, but I'd rather understand and make sure that there is equality of opportunity before declaring success. And, until I know that, I think maybe it's my inclination, I will worry that, some things may not be functioning right that delivers this outcome. But there's a separate point, if we don't fully know that there's equality of opportunity, which is to me doubtful, we know how increasing inequality has led to in the past. We know the world history. And that itself, it has political ramifications, it has, social ramifications, and I'm actually worried about those in a very serious manner.
Well, look, the question is mostly academic because we clearly don't have equality of opportunity. I mean, if you want one damning perspective on equality of opportunity in today's America, if you look at 8th grade test scores, the top 25% of scorers who come from, so if you look at the kids who are in the top 25% of the test distribution in 8th grade, those who come from the bottom 25% of the income distribution complete college only at the same rate, not any higher, only at the same rate as students in 8th grade who score in the bottom 25% of the distribution who are from the top 25% of the income distribution. That just shouldn't happen. College enrollment rates and college completion rates by socioeconomic status are growing more unequal, not less unequal. And so I think what we are learning is there's a whole set of, from mentoring to support structures to a whole environment that is necessary. And the myth of, I'm just going to study hard and succeed, does work for some people, but it is very, very rare in general. And there's a lot more to it than just kind of, let's go, Junior, you can study hard and make it.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then we've got about 14 minutes. I'm going to see if the audience has any, so get your questions ready. So during the period that both of you were looking in your studies, I saw two different growth trajectories and two different productivity trajectories. So my question that I'm going to come to after laying it out for the group is, would that have mattered? Would higher growth and higher productivity have driven higher wage gains and higher incomes, or is that a theory of growth economics that we shouldn't believe in? The background for the audience, over the course of most of the 70s, coming out of the recession of 81, 82, during most of the 80s and 90s, what we found were very high levels of economic growth, very high productivity rates, And you saw, not perfect, but you saw high productivity rates find their way into higher wage incomes. What we've found over the course of the last several administrations, Democrat and Republican, are growth rates that are coming down, nominal and real growths that are coming down. That was true before the financial crisis. It is more true after the financial crisis. We're finding our assessment of how productive is the society. We're running at productivity rates of around 2.4 or 2.5% during most of the so-called Great Moderation. We've been running at productivity rates both before the crisis and after that are declining. So my question to both of you in growth economics, which is, if the economy in the US were growing at a real terms at 3% a year, if productivity were growing at 2 or 2.5 instead of around 1%, would that be doing enough, in your judgment, to change wage incomes? And would that make the charts that we saw less terrifying prospectively?
It would certainly be better. It would help. Depending on which part of the income distribution you're on, it may or may not offset all of it. And I think we should talk about humility. We should have a significant amount of humility with regard to what the future productivity growth rate will be. There have been recently some longish books that seem like they are prematurely definitive on the topic of what future productivity growth will be. Two things quickly on that. One is, if you were to be worried, I would be worried because of this evidence of declining dynamism in the US economy. So the rate of new business entry declining, job churn declining, geographic mobility declining, all of that would be a cause of concern, and I'd want to try to focus on why that is happening. The second issue, though, comes back to measurement, which is I do not think that you can explain the entire decline in productivity growth, which has been dramatic, through increased measurement issues. But on the other hand, as the economy increasingly shifts towards healthcare, education, and other sectors where we measure quality less well, it would not be surprising that the quality bias, if you will, becomes larger over time. And that's only underscored by all the new technology. So we're in New York City. I'm sure everyone in this room uses Uber. If you compare Uber to car services of 20 years ago or 15 years ago, that change will basically, to the extent that you're paying a lower price for Uber, it's going to show up as a decline in GDP. You're paying less for a service. But I think basically everyone would argue that it's more convenient because, I mean, the amount of time I have wasted with the car service saying we're in front, no you're not, where are you, call dispatch, I don't even understand the whole system of we'll get the driver finally, and 20 minutes later you find out where the car is, which basically just doesn't happen. Today that shows up as a decline in GDP. Now, you have to argue that a lot of these things were happening gradually over the past 20 or 30 years. You have to argue that they've become much more prominent today. But I think there's at least part of the productivity decline, growth decline, that you can, that is at least plausibly linked to measurement issues, not all of it.
Okay, I'm not going to let you end up back on empirical measurement issues, which is our fascination. And I'm not going to note for the crowd that neither Google nor Facebook, because their products are free, show up anywhere in our national accounts. And yet we somehow think we're measuring the strength of this economy. We're not going to end there. We're going to end with your judgment on whether higher growth and higher productivity would make these results better, whether that should be an aspiration of policymakers, or whether policymakers should say, well, more growth would be better, but really the name of the game is redistributing income who ended up in the bottom decile or bottom quartile.
So it's very difficult to sort out causality, what's the chicken, what's the egg. But I want to point out two periods in the recent US history where very fast growth actually lifted all the boats. So one example is the 1960s. If you look at the US economic growth from 1960 to 1973, it's very rapid. And one thing that you actually see is the top 1% income growth was the same as the bottom 1% income growth rate. And all the percentiles in between were growing virtually at the same rate. So that's one example. The other example actually, in the 1973 to 2013 40-year period, the only short-lived period where we had very fast productivity growth, GDP growth, and declining inequality was 1995 to 2000. So for 5 years there, we had fast growth and declining inequality. I don't want to put this in like causal terms. I don't know what was the chicken, what was the egg. But it's certainly true that when you have fast growth in GDP and productivity, you do seem to see, inequality not growing or doing better. I will leave it at that. So my answer will be possibly yes, but without pushing it too far.
Okay, we have 10 minutes now to take questions from all of you, and if you don't have it, I'm going to call on Gary Stern so he can be ready. Questions? I see one here in the front. There's a microphone coming your way.
Took a note so I wouldn't take too long here. Great study, obviously. You both framed it on a firm level, taking a look at it. And my question, being a younger person, looking at the skills and salary gathering at high-performing firms, how much of that is the increase in cost of top-tier education and the search for ROI from these employees?
Well, I mean, yeah. I guess a couple things. So I don't think it's we're going to pay you more because your education cost you more. Most employers, frankly, don't really look at the world that way. So there's something else that's going on. I should have said, by the way, 2/3 of the very high return on invested capital firms are either in information technology, so they are the Googles and the Facebooks, or they're in healthcare, and in particular in pharmaceuticals or medical devices, but especially pharmaceuticals. And there, again, I think there's the big question here. Maybe I should have said this. Big question is, let's take Facebook as an example. Is Facebook earning very high returns on invested capital because the network effect is very large, and it means other people can't really enter to offset it? And that's a good thing because Facebook's been so innovative and it connects people, and now I know where my high school roommate or a college roommate, is spending vacations or whatever. Or is Facebook effectively a monopoly that's extracting monopoly rents from us because we give Facebook our information for free and they monetize it through advertising in a way that we should actually be compensated for? I don't know, but I guess my point is that question may have a lot more to do with inequality than you would initially have imagined. So I think those sorts of questions are driving the pay at Facebook much more than what the tuition is at Stanford, in my opinion.
Other questions? Here in the second row, microphone coming.
Kevin, you said at the beginning that quantitative easing may have contributed to wealth inequality. If it did, and yet people at the bottom came up somewhat because they had jobs and they wouldn't have had jobs otherwise, would that be an acceptable trade-off?
Right, so it's a good question. So I guess the moderator is going to have to answer this one. I'd encourage my colleagues to weigh in. So in the design of quantitative easing, which came about in the darkest of times, where I should say that we had no idea that quantitative easing would become the thing that would be the great policy that would be copied by every other central bank in the world, and 7 years later we would still be sort of in full-on QE in much of the world. I think the original understanding of it, which Chairman Bernanke describes as the portfolio balance channel, what we're going to do is we would find assets that were falling so fast in the crisis that they were dragging down the real side of the economy. Because the central bank has access to a balance sheet and a printing press and can't directly affect income statements, and the rest of the Congress and the political authorities didn't seem as though they were that keen to come up with a momentary moment to come up with tax reform, fiscal policy that we might have thought was going to do great things for the economy. The central bank said, well, we'll run the printing press. We'll take assets that are out there. We will get them to run ahead of where the real economy is, and that will drag up the real side of the economy. My judgment here is different than the Federal Reserve's. My judgment is that quantitative easing works through a different transmission mechanism than traditional interest rates. It has an effect on financial assets much more than it has an effect on the credit channel or the confidence channel, other traditional channels of monetary policy. So it wasn't the Fed's objective to make rich people richer, but those were the ones who had the assets, and that was what we could affect. Now, under the Fed view, the wealth that was created in assets, my words, not theirs, trickled down. trickled down to the rest of the country, the half that don't have financial assets, made the economic recovery stronger than it would have otherwise have made, brought the unemployment rate down. So it first affected, in some sense, the high end of the distribution, and then it affected everyone else. Now, they don't call that trickle-down economics. It doesn't really sort of resonate quite as well. In the old days, we used to call that not the portfolio balance channel, we call it the wealth effect, because it works best on the wealthy. That's why we called it that. So their best argument, I think, is that quantitative easing did as much for the real side as it did for the financial asset side. There is no way to prove the counterfactual. There are no control groups in almost anything that the three of us do for a living. I would just sort of ask the question and suggest that the effects on financial assets seem to be really quite pronounced. As a matter of fact, when the Federal Reserve at various points threatened over the last 5 years to get out of this business of quantitative easing, we saw asset prices move very quickly. So it's difficult for me to judge how strong the economy would be but for this redistributionist policy that had a perfectly good intent. It might be unfair, but I'd judge it this way. Let's compare the real outcome in the economy to what the Fed forecasted. Well, in 2009, at the Fed, we forecasted the GDP in 2010 would be about 4.5%, and it was 2. In 2010, we predicted that the GDP in the economy would be 4.3%, and it was 2. Well, you get the joke. The economy has grown at around 2%, subject to all these revisions, very steadily from the middle of 2009, when quantitative easing 1 was transitioning to quantitative easing 2 by 2010, was growing at 2% throughout this period. Now, that could be a coincidence. According to the more traditional description from my Fed colleagues, because of the targeted, timely use of quantitative easing, we kept the economy growing at that rate. But for continued quantitative easing, the economy would have fallen maybe even back into recession. I find it either a remarkably adroit assistance of policy, or the economy was on a 2% trajectory with or without quantitative easing. There is no QED to QE. I can't prove any of these things. But I do think what we can say is the effect on the financial market side was certainly first, and maybe it did have those effects on the real side. My quasi-political judgment is part of the reason why the Fed is a dirty word on talk radio right now, why the central bank gets trashed in many of the political discourse, is because most real people that don't have big balance sheets, they're still waiting for it to trickle down to them. They don't think that Ben Bernanke or Janet Yellen were trying to make rich people richer. They don't assign that intent. But they're waiting for average hourly incomes to move up. They're waiting for their income statement to do as well as the balance sheet wealth they've heard about. And in some sense, in 2016, I think our politics is part because half the population is still waiting.
So I guess I would just add a couple things. One is this general argument, regardless of where you put the trade-off, is yet another point in favor of fiscal stimulus as opposed to monetary stimulus in the face of the kind of crisis that we faced. And the Fed would not have faced quite as severe a set of trade-offs if fiscal policy had not been stultified and stuck. So you're kind of debating whether you think you're going to help a little, even if there are some other consequences. We left kind of on the table the more obvious, more potent thing. And that brings me to my second point. There actually was a huge amount of stimulus delivered in the fourth quarter of 2009. The issue was both the administration and the Fed misjudged the nature of the recovery, assumed it would be V-shaped instead of L-shaped. And that in turn came disproportionately from assuming that the economy would behave after the housing bust, just like it did following the IT bust. Because the reason the macroeconometric models were saying that is they were sort of treating this as if it were IT bust 2.0, because the initial loss of wealth was similar. And that highlights the core problem in those models, which is they don't have a detailed financial sector. In the IT bust, the losses were spread across pretty diversified equity markets. In the housing bust, they were concentrated in highly levered financial institutions. Those are dramatically different things that most of the macroeconometric models don't have built into them, and they mispredicted as a result. The result of that was to misdesign the fiscal stimulus, take that off the table, and leave the Fed as the only game in town, which then produced regardless of whether, I don't think there's anyone who would argue that the QE produced dramatic, miraculous real economic activity. So we're down to this debate where Kevin kind of says it was almost zero, and even the strongest proponents say, well, it wasn't zero, but it was something.
Just to add one little thing, I think I agree with Peter that if you try to predict the recovery pace from previous US recessions, you would reach that conclusion. But actually, we have a wealth of evidence from many countries. And what you see in other countries, and Robert Barrow, Reinhardt and Rogoff and others have looked at this. If you look at recoveries from recessions that were precipitated with a housing bust, you actually see much longer recoveries that take 7 to 10 years. So from that perspective, actually, maybe we can say it shouldn't have been that big of a surprise. But I agree, if you only use the US data to make the prediction, that's not an unexpected conclusion.
So I think we're going to have to leave it there. We appreciate the university hosting us. I think this was a robust discussion where we tried to do our best to separate what we know and then what we think about the policy prescriptions could be. Maybe as we enter Super Tuesday and the political season in front of us, some of this will find its way into the public square. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin.
So it's my distinct honor and pleasure to thank our panelists, Fatih, Peter, and Kevin. A small token of our gratitude and appreciation. Thank you. If I can untangle this. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. I wanted to thank our sponsor tonight, Litigation Analytics, and their president and a distinguished alum of the University of Minnesota's Economics Department, John Scarborough. Thank you, John, for doing this. We have an extraordinarily committed advisory board. This is one of the great things, pleasures as far as I'm concerned, of being director of this institute. And so I'd like to thank, in particular, the people who are here, Carla Hagen, Bob Litterman, Jose Perez, Norm Reckman, Gary Stern, and Kurt Winkleman. Thank you very much for joining. And we've had a grim discussion at some level. Fatih admitted to being terrified. Let me cast a slightly different spin on it, which might be worthwhile thinking while we indulge in refreshments, which is a different perspective. From a different perspective, the last 40 years have witnessed the largest decline in income inequality and the largest increase in mobility of incomes that the world has experienced in its history. I refer, of course, to the worldwide distribution of incomes rather than the more parochial perspective, but appropriate, that we have taken today. So with that thought, join me and let's have some refreshments. Thank you again very much. Let's give the panelists a big hand.